Not loud enough.
I think I just saw him drive off. I'm just gonna give it a minute. Hold on. Oh. Yeah. Nine what? Or something. Or just the, what's her name?
Ted, can you hear me now?
So Matt and Administrator Spearman, can you guys hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Ted, can you hear me?
Matt, can you hear me?
I can hear you. It sounded like you cannot hear me.
So Ted, you cannot hear this?
Can you hear me, Matt?
I can. You cannot hear me.
So I can hear you guys, but Matt, can you just let, oh. I think we need better makeup people. There are a lot of shiny heads on my screen right now.
How can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
I can. So could you just let Administrator Spearman know that I'm going to have to be switching back and forth between the live feed audio and the Zoom audio if I'm going to say anything, because I can't really make out what anybody's saying and they're over the Zoom audio.
Do you see a need to rehearse something?
I'm sorry?
First of all, everybody in the room can hear that, so your message has been passed. Do you see a need to rehearse that process before because we don't have a witness here right now?
No, I just wanted to let folks know that I'm going to have to be transitioning from machine to machine. Otherwise, there's going to be reverb. I'm going to have to mute one so that I can hear the one that I can hear better. So I just, if you don't hear from me right away, it's because I'm fixing the machine so I can speak.
Understood. Is it possible to just keep your laptops off the whole time and the audio off the whole time for the exchange that? And just unmute, but not be muted. We turn on the volume on silence your laptop, not mute your microphone on your laptop, and only mute on your screen.
Can you hear me?
Okay, do you still need to feel, do you feel that you still need to switch back and forth, or do you have a good solution?
Can you hear?
It didn't look like you heard me, Ted. Did you hear me? You're muted.
Your Honor.
Where did?
I can hear Karen fine, but whoever's speaking.
Oh. Sorry.
So I am in witness seat, and if you're having difficulty hearing me, we need to know that. Did you just hear what I said?
Okay, so in the witness seat, if I'm on Zoom, I can hear you just fine. It's when I can't hear you is when I'm on the live stream. So if I'm going to be questioning a witness, I'll just go to Zoom. Otherwise, I should be okay on live stream and can hear what's going on.
Okay.
I know you made a ruling on that issue that was raised by Ms. Kohler this morning.
Yes.
Mr. Buck was not able to hear what was going on, so if we could have a sidebar on that issue.
Sidebar, I can advise Mr.
Now, I would like to share some additional information on that. I thought he was going to speak up, but he couldn't hear what was going on that issue. There is going to be testimony from Officer Anderson, which is confirmed in Officer Dewey's or Detective Dewey's testimony, that after he pulled his gun, Ms. Lyles said, "Do it."
Yes.
And the whole issue of ambush was brought up by the family, saying that because of the prior incident, these officers should have been aware that there could have been a potential ambush in that situation. And so we believe the testimony supports an inference, Your Honor, that we're not sure what the motivation was.
Correct. Yes, I agree with that. We're not clear what the motivation was, so it's sort of speculative to go into any testimony about what that motivation might have been. Yeah, but that was my rule.
Speculation that the family is making
Hold on,
is that it was due to mental illness. So why is it
It, it,
When I have
on what issue?
this tech issue,
Sure.
Karen and Mr. Buck, Mr. Buck, assuming that I'm interested in having Mr. Buck be the officer, if we could just get through today, I mean, maybe it could be fixed by tomorrow, maybe it can't in time for the officers. Can we just proceed under that basis?
We can proceed with Officer Davison.
As soon as Davison gets here.
He's here. Yeah.
Oh, he is here?
Yes.
Okay.
And, Mr. Buck was prepared for,
Frankly, Ms. Wynn was gonna do Mr. Repton, so we're kind of in the same boat. I'm doing Mr. Repton and you do Mr. Repton, and we can start tomorrow fresh with the officers, and either he can participate or he can't.
let's go forward with Davison.
I think that's fair enough. We'll see if we can get through with Davidson today. I hope so.
Just one more matter, Your Honor, is, yesterday there was some fairly blatant violations of the motion limiting on number 10 regarding raising of the issue of race, and we'd like to reiterate that that's inappropriate.
Oh, I think I addressed that yesterday. I think that's settled. Yes.
Is that making noise in the back?
Yes. Okay. Well, here it is.
Yeah.
All please rise.
The inquest administrator called Captain George Davidson.
Right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you give in the proceedings will be the truth? Yes.
Administrator, did you give the advisement regarding the mask?
No, in fact, I gave him the opposite advice today, that I'd ask him to keep his mask on.
Thank you. All right, could you please?
Just one moment. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your patience this morning. I think we've taken a number of precautions to try to make you feel safe and secure. In particular, I have asked the attorneys, the parties, and the staff of the inquest program all to be tested going forward, to be tested on a daily basis before they report to the hearing room. They've all agreed to do that, and so I think that adds a little element of security in terms of any sort of COVID risk. So, but I appreciate your willingness to continue to serve, and I appreciate you putting up with our activities this morning and being as patient as you have been. All right? We ready to begin?
Yes.
Let's start.
Could you please state your full name for the record and spell your last name?
It's George Davison, Davisson.
And you work for Seattle Police Department?
Yes, ma'am.
What is your rank?
I'm a lieutenant. I'm currently a permanent acting captain. So my actual rank is lieutenant, but I'm working in acting capacity.
What does that
Ms.
mean?
Thornton, I'm going to hold the mic a little closer.
Okay. What does acting captain mean? Permanent acting captain?
That means that I perform all the duties of a captain of the unit, but I have not achieved the rank yet.
How long have you been doing that?
As acting captain for about a year, as a lieutenant for the last 2 years.
And what unit are you in?
Currently in the policy and research section.
What does the policy and research section do?
We draft policy. We work with the accountability partners as well as command staff and other units to draft policy to give guidance to officers on the expectations of how to navigate law, as well as the expectations of the command staff.
You've been in that unit for 3 years then?
About 2.5 now.
Thank you. And you're here today as the Seattle Police Department representative to provide testimony about the policies that are relevant in this case. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
So are you familiar with the entire Seattle Police Department policy manual?
I will say that I've had to take the promotional exams, both for the sergeant and lieutenant and captain level. So I've read through the majority, if not all, of the policies at one point in time or another during my career. But the policies do change regularly, and they get updated regularly. So it's kind of a study. You have to continue to study it.
When changes or updates are made, is the entire department notified that they need to take a look at the updates?
Yes, ma'am.
How many pages is the manual?
So
Approximately.
I couldn't hazard a guess. I'd have to pull it up. I think it's in the thousands. So.
Okay. Does the policy manual give specific guidance for every, let me ask you what the purpose of the manual is first.
Again, it's to give guidance and expectations for officers to navigate law and policy, and what their expectations are with regards to state, federal, and local laws, and how to interact with the public and how to engage with the public and make sure that we set expectations for officers when they're in the field.
Does it also include policies directed at supervising personnel?
Yes, the policies provide guidance to all SPD employees.
Thank you. Does it give guidance about, for every situation that an officer might face?
No, that's not possible.
What is an officer supposed to do when there is not a specific policy facing the issue that they're dealing with?
So the policy gives general guidance to officers, and then they're supposed to use their best judgment that they can, and use the policies as kind of a guide to direct their actions.
And how are officers made aware of the manual when they first join the department?
When they first join the department, they're given copies of the manual and they're asked to study it. When they go to, initially, when you go to the Washington State Police Academy, it's 720 hours, and it's based primarily on state laws and state regulations. And then post-academy, we go to what we call post-Polio, which is a Seattle-specific academy for about 3 weeks to a month, where we learn specific Seattle-oriented Seattle laws. There's laws specific to Seattle. There's ways that we do things that are not necessarily the same way that the state does things. And policies can be more restrictive than law. So we have to kind of guide and teach officers what we expect once they get out and once they become a Seattle police officer.
And it's during that post-BLEA time where they're probably learning the most about the manual, is that right?
Yes, and they're working with their field training officers and going over manual sections and learning about what they're expected to do.
And when any officer is on duty, he or she or they are required to comply with all agency policies, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
But, excuse me, obviously a particular policy may not be relevant to the particular actions that an officer is taking or doesn't take depending on the circumstances, is that right?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure, that's a difficult, really worded question. A particular policy might not apply to something that's going on with the officer, so they're just applying certain policies in each situation, is that right?
Correct. There's policies on domestic violence, there's policies on arrests, and the officer may not be handling that type of a call. They might not be making a domestic violence arrest. They might not even be contacting somebody. So I do also want to jump back to how officers are taught about the policy. They also have training throughout their career as well. In addition to that, our unit puts out new policies or any kind of updates to policies. It goes out in what's called an E-directive. And officers are required to read over those and then sign, either take question, like a sample test of what the new information is, and then sign off on acknowledging that they've read those items.
And is that regularly monitored by the department?
The policy unit is the one that pushes that out, and it is basically recorded on who read each of the policies or who's clicked indicating that they understood the policy.
And officers receive ongoing training during their employment with SPD, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And can you please describe the relationship between training and policy? Which dictates which and how they work together?
They kind of feed off of each other in order to train officers on, when a new law comes about, policy has to be written on the law to give guidance to the officers, but then the officers also need training on those new laws and how to actually go out into the real world and apply what is being thought up by the politicians and the people and what laws they have enacted.
And then in addition to the policy manual and training, they may also receive directives from their supervisors, is that right?
That's correct.
Can you compare the authority of a directive from a supervisor to written policy and training?
Well, we have a command structure on the police department, and similar to civilian world, where if your boss tells you to do something, you're required to do it. Same with the department. It's kind of it used to be considered more of a paramilitary organization, but it's just a rank structure, and you're expected to perform the duties and listen to your supervisors and act based off of what they're giving guidance on as well.
And turning to this case, you're aware of the facts and circumstances of this officer-involved shooting that led to the death of Charleena Lyles?
Yes, ma'am.
And how did you become aware of what happened in this case? Were you involved at the time of the incident?
At the time of the incident, no, but during the time of the whole incident, meaning the time frame, I was the force investigation sergeant for the Seattle Police Department at the time. So I was the supervisor of the detectives that investigated this case.
So we heard from Sergeant or Detective Dewey last week, or Sergeant Dewey. Were you his supervisor and sergeant at that time?
Yes, ma'am.
So in addition to strike that, did you supervise the entire investigation and sign off on it ultimately when it was finished?
Yes, initially when the incident took place, I was not present. I was on funeral leave and I came back, I think it happened on the 18th. I came back to work on the 19th of June. And I attended events after that and met with the detectives and supervised the case from then on.
So, and you became familiar with the facts, would you say?
Yes, ma'am.
And that was 5 years ago, obviously, did you refresh your memory about the facts of what happened prior to coming here today?
Yes, ma'am.
What all did you review prior to coming today?
A large swath of the force investigation case, including officer statements, video, my statement, the CAD logs. I wouldn't say the whole case, but a large piece of it, a large component.
And you also reviewed some policies from the manual that were in effect at the time of June 18th, 2017.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm going to, if you can locate in the notebooks there in front of you, exhibit number 60, it has the copy of the policies that we're going to talk about. Would you turn to the third page in that packet?
That's 1682.
Or I'm looking for Title 8 use of force. Is that the next page?
Okay.
Thank you. And we also have it up on the screen here for the jury to look at. This is titled Title 8 use of force. And in the use of force core principles. Could you just summarize what are core principles? What's the purpose of them? And specifically to the use of force policies?
Yeah, if I could read the second paragraph or the second sentence in there, it kind of describes what the purpose of the core principles are.
Go ahead.
It says, these general principles provide the foundation for more specific policies governing the application, reporting, investigation, and use of force. The department recognizes that officers will face unique and challenging circumstances not specifically addressed in this policy. Officers are expected to apply these core principles reasonably in unanticipated situations.
So the core principles are then explained in more detail in the other sections of this chapter, is that right?
That's correct.
You could turn until you get to the page that has 8.200. Is that how you refer to it, or do you say 8200?
8.200. Okay.
And what is the title of this?
Using force, use of force when authorized.
So let me just grab the screen here. Thank you. So obviously this is titled use of force when authorized, you indicated. When is use of force authorized by policy by the Seattle Police Department? Would you like to read the first paragraphs there that
Yeah.
explain.
An officer shall only use the force reasonable, necessary, and proportionate to effectively bring an incident or person under control while protecting the lives of the officer or others.
And the next paragraph.
In other words, the officer shall only use objectively reasonable force proportional to the threat or urgency of the situation when necessary to achieve a law enforcement objective. The force used must comply with the federal and state and law and Seattle Police Department policies, training, and rules for specific instruments and devices. Once it is safe to do so and the threat is contained, the force must stop. Finish that.
Sure.
When determining if force was objectively reasonable, necessary, and proportionate, and therefore authorized, the following guidelines shall be applied.
And then the policy goes into detail of explaining what reasonable is, what necessary is, and what proportional is. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Rather than having you read all those sections, I want to ask you if this provision applied to Officer Anderson and Officer McNew in this situation.
Yes, ma'am.
And did they comply with this provision in your opinion?
Yes, ma'am.
If you could please explain your reasoning for that opinion to the jury.
Sure. For force to be considered authorized within state law and department policy, it has to be reasonable, necessary, and proportional. Reasonableness is judged based on the officer's information, the totality of the circumstances the officer knew at the time. If you don't mind, I'd like to read from here. Is that okay?
Yeah, if
Okay.
it helps to explain
Yeah.
your opinion, thank you.
So the reasonableness of a particular use of force is based on the totality of the circumstances known to the officer at the time of the use of force and weighs the actions of the officer against those rights of the subject in light of the circumstances surrounding the event. It must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene rather than with a 20/20 vision of hindsight. So what that means is that an officer's actions have to be judged on what they knew at that time, what they were faced with, what they were encountering. And it's not judged by a reasonable person, it's judged by a reasonable officer with similar training or similar circumstances. And the component of not being judged with 20/20 vision of hindsight means that, I mean, in this case, people have had 5 years to pick it apart and look through it and determine what they believe could have happened differently. Where those officers have, the other part of this is the calculus with officers having to make split-second decisions in often tense and changing situations, very dynamic situations. So they have to make those decisions within seconds, and then people can essentially Monday morning quarterback and review that case repeatedly in every single step that those officers took. And that's not what how they're judged. They're judged based off of what they were faced with at the time and in that moment.
Your Honor, I'm going to move to strike this witness's comments that for the past 5 years, the officer's actions have been picked apart, that there's been Monday night quarterbacking, whatever that is. And
The jury will disregard those comments.
thank you.
So you discussed what is reasonableness when some, I was trying to remember what I was going to ask you before the objection.
No.
You said when officers are judged based on these standards, who's judging them?
So specifically for our department, we have a force review board. And that is made up of members of the department, generally lieutenants and above, that look over the case and determine whether or not that was within policy, within law, and if it followed our training as well.
And here your opinion is that they did comply with this policy. So please continue your explanation as to why.
Yeah, so the reasonableness component, as I mentioned, the officers were faced. Well, I'll go on to the next part, which is necessary. And the necessary definition is that no reasonably effective alternative to the force appeared to exist. And that only to the extent was the force reasonable to affect the lawful purpose. We have jumbled that a little bit, but essentially that if the force is necessary, that force can be used, but only to the point that the lawful purpose or the lawful intent is achieved. So in this case, they were presented with a person with knives, reportedly with knives that were attacking them or approaching them. One officer indicated that the female attempted to stab him, which he responded in kind with lethal force. And then the last component.
Let me just ask you one
Sorry,
more.
please,
So the main factor in that necessary determination is whether or not there was any reasonable, effective alternative. Is that right?
Correct. And that goes into the proportional, which is what I'll get into as well. But the proportionality of the force is based again on the totality of the circumstances known to the officer at the time and what they're faced with. And that to be proportional force doesn't mean that it has to be equal force based off of the threat and the immediacy of the threat and whether or not the threat could potentially cause serious physical injury or death to the officers. More force may be justified or may be found reasonable and necessary to counter that threat.
And could you read out loud the last sentence there of the proportional?
I missed what you said at the beginning there. I'm
Sorry, could you please read out loud the last sentence of that proportional section?
Yes, the more immediate the threat and the more likely that the threat will result in the death or serious physical injury, the greater the level of force that may be proportional, objectively reasonable, and necessary to counter it.
And now taking all three of those things into account and reflecting on what happened in this situation, can you explain to the jury how the officer's actions in a totality were reasonable, necessary, and proportional in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, it starts when they arrive and they approach and they contact Miss Lyles. They initially are responding for what essentially is a cold burglary, which is essentially a paper call for the police department. In other words, that we're going there anticipating investigating a burglary, talking to the victim, getting the information and then documenting that. That encounter, based off of in-car video and officers' reports and evidence from the scene, appeared to be very cordial. The officers engaged with Miss Lyles from the beginning, spoke to her. She invited them into the apartment. And then Officer Anderson and McNew gathered information about the burglary and followed Miss Lyles throughout the department where she was pointing out items that she was reporting had been stolen. Again, the officers indicated in the in-car video also kind of reflects that the encounter was very cordial. There was exchange of information. There were questions and answers. That nothing kind of triggered the fact that there may be something else happening. At one point in time, Officer Anderson is asking Miss Lyles about the Xbox that was stolen. And he indicated he was writing in his notebook about that information. And then she produced a knife from her pocket and had it in her hand and attempted to stab him, which I was sitting in on the interview when he gave his account of that and indicated that he had to jump backwards or move backwards and suck in his stomach to prevent being stabbed or to avoid being stabbed. So going from as I mentioned, a paper call to being attacked with a lethal weapon, the officer drew his firearm and pointed it at Miss Lyles and gave her commands to get back, multiple commands to get back. Continuing on, Officer Anderson gave or advised dispatch that he needed a fast backup, which indicates to dispatch that we need more officers there, more resources to assist in the situation. Officer McNew was in a kitchen area. I mean, much detail.
I think that it's helpful to, if the things that happen are, go into your opinion that they comply with the policies, then for sure. I was going to ask you next what Officer McNew was doing at the time when Officer Anderson was taking down that information, saw the knife and drew his firearm. What was Officer McNew doing?
Yeah, so all of the details, all the case for the force review board, it gets reviewed from the time that the call is dispatched all the way through the conclusion of the call. So all of it is taken into account, especially kind of what led up to it, what information they had, and what they ultimately did. And I can go into more detail, of course. But at the time that the knife was produced, Officer McNew indicated that he was in a kitchen area, which is kind of a U-shaped kitchen area with only one exit, which is the way you come in. And that he was looking around at different things in the kitchen, including, I believe, a meatloaf that was on the kitchen counter. And then he heard a commotion and looked up and saw that Miss Lyles had a knife in her hand. Indicated that she was just on the, or just in the living room area on the other side, kind of on the other side of the counter, and that he knew that Officer Anderson was to his left. He indicated that Miss Lyles appeared to take the knife kind of over her shoulder, and in what he described as kind of a baseball windup for a baseball player, appeared to be winding up to throw the knife at him. He indicated that he ducked down and covered his face to avoid being stuck with the knife in the face. And then when he noticed that he wasn't stuck with the knife, he came back up and noticed that Miss Lyles had two knives, one in each hand. And that she was now coming forward from the living room area, coming around the edge of the island of the kitchen. And that he thought about different things, whether or not he could get out of the area, or excuse me, out of that kitchen area. He thought about potential crossfire situation if she continued to come forward. Crossfire meaning that the officers would be in a situation where if they fired their handgun, that they would potentially shoot each other. And that as she came around the island with the two knives, he made the decision to fire and fire the weapon. At the same time, Officer Anderson, independently with his own decision-making, decided to fire as well.
At what point did Officer McNew draw his firearm?
When the exact timing of when he drew it, I wouldn't know, but he drew it from the time that when she had the knife in her hand, or in the knife in her hand, when he recognized that. He drew it.
Is that before he ducked down?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. So based on the totality of those circumstances, it's your opinion that it was reasonable, necessary, and proportional use of force for both of them to fire shots at Miss Lyles?
Yeah, based on the information that they had up to that point, what they were encountering, I believe if you look at the CAD call and you look at the time from the first order of get back to the time the shots were fired was roughly 19 seconds. So the officers had 19 seconds to determine whether or not they needed to address the threat, the immediate threat that was in front of them. Part of policy is whether or not they de-escalated or attempted de-escalation. Part of those are verbal commands and warnings, which both officers were giving orders to Miss Lyles to get back. And Miss Lyles continued to, at one point in time, she stepped back, but then came forward towards the officers. So taking it all into account based off the information they had when they got to the call, the fact that they made a plan walking up to the call, and the fact that they went from a paper call, and almost nearly completed paper call, to being forced with a lethal force encounter. All that was taken into account. And yes, with those factors into account, they acted within policy.
And you said the information that they had when they were coming into the situation and the plan that they made, the jury has heard a lot about that, but are you referring to the officer safety caution and the summarized report that Officer Anderson reviewed?
Yes, ma'am.
And then their plan to not let her get behind them?
That's correct.
So you mentioned de-escalation. Let's move to that now. 8.100 de-escalation. You're familiar with that, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And I'd like you to read the first section, number 1, and the first 2 paragraphs, please.
Okay. When safe and under the totality of the circumstances and time and circumstances permit, officers shall use de-escalation tactics in order to reduce the need for force. De-escalation tactics and techniques are actions used by officers when safe and without compromising the law enforcement priorities that seek to minimize the likelihood of the need to use force during an incident and increase the likelihood of voluntary compliance. When safe and feasible under the totality of the circumstances, officers shall attempt to slow down or stabilize the situation so that more time, options, and resources are available for the incident resolution.
We heard, the jury heard yesterday about when de-escalation is used in crisis intervention situations, potentially in taser situations. But does this de-escalation policy apply across the board to all situations or just to the use of force situation? Well, I guess it's always you're deciding whether to use force, right? But would this be the same information that officers would be trained in crisis intervention or in the use of force training, or is it the basic definition?
Objection made.
Thank you. So in looking down at the, towards the bottom there of this policy, there are a number of examples that are listed for types of de-escalation that officers can use. Can you just go through those with the jury, please?
Sure. Some of the examples listed are placing barriers between an uncooperative subject and an officer, containing a threat, moving from a position that exposes officers to potential threats to a safer position, decreasing the exposure to potential threat by using distance, cover, concealment, communication from a safe position intended to gain the subject's compliance using verbal persuasion, advisements, warnings, avoidance of physical confrontation unless immediately necessary. For example, to protect someone or stop dangerous behavior, using verbal techniques such as listen and explain with equity and dignity. Training to calm an agitated subject and promote rational decision-making, calling for extra resources to assist an officer or to assist or officers to assist more officers, CIT officers, officers equipped with less lethal tools, any other tactics and approaches that attempt to achieve law enforcement objectives by gaining the compliance of the subject.
And in your opinion, did this policy apply to Officers Anderson and Officer McNew in the situation with Ms. Lyles?
Yes, I will say that, I mean, from the time that the officers got there, they were employing de-escalation tactics. From Officer Anderson calling for an additional unit when he noticed that there's a potential caution. We're taught that additional officers can be a form of de-escalation as well. You have additional resources. You also have numbers. So oftentimes people don't necessarily need to use force because they see kind of the additional officer there and decide that they don't want to fight or resist officers. In addition, they make a plan when they're going up, which is kind of the pre-planning, the hasty plan to figure out, you know, what our plan of contact will be. They perform in a contact cover role, so you have one person doing the majority of the investigation while the other person is in kind of a cover mode. When presented with the lethal threat with the knife, they both use verbal commands and orders to try to get the person to voluntarily comply and back up. Officer Anderson tried to create distance. Officer McNew, I believe, also tried to back up, limited area for Officer McNew to back up into. there was, whether or not they could use cover at the time. Officer McNew was in a kind of, I think he said, unabated access to him. In other words, that there was nothing in front of him that he could use as shielding or cover, and she could have unabated access to him. They called for additional resources, which is another aspect of that. When they called for fast backup, I think Officer McNew also at one point in time indicated that they need more officers and that they had a woman with 2 knives. So to the point that they tried de-escalation, but ultimately it takes multiple people or it takes 2 parties to engage in de-escalation. If the other party doesn't participate in it, then de-escalation is no longer feasible.
And by the other party here, you're talking about Ms. Lyles, is that right?
That's correct.
And then talking about creating distance between them, you said that Officer Anderson attempted to create distance. How did he do that?
He indicated that he backed up. From the hallway video, you can see that he appears to come out into the hallway a little bit. Officer McNew also tried to back up, but limited space in the kitchen prevented further.
So from your knowledge, and Officer Anderson was near the door of the apartment, is that right?
That's correct.
And that in order to create distance, he backed up into the hallway. So the apartment door must have been open, is that correct?
I don't know if it was open or if he opened it, but at some point in time, you do see in the hallway video that he does back up into the hallway a little bit. And
that was a step of de-escalation, in your opinion?
It's creating distance. It's giving you time to react, the hope of time to react. By creating distance, it allows for options generally.
You said that Officer McNew also took a step back. Do you know where he was? Do you know how long the kitchen was approximately?
I don't know exactly. I think it's roughly 6 to 8 feet. And I do know that at the time that he said that he decided to fire, he had about 2 feet behind him. So he didn't have much room to move at that point in time.
And at that point, where was Ms. Lyles?
She, at that time, was coming around the edge of the island. Based off of Officer McNew's perspective photography. In other words, post-incident, we try to have the officer walk through and kind of show us where they believe they were. And again, it's a perceptual thing, where they believe they were standing at the time shots were fired and where Ms. Lyles was, and whether or not they can place their partner if the partner didn't do a walkthrough.
And so if Officer McNew had 2 feet behind him, at that point was Ms. Lyles focused on him alone?
At that point in time, he was, I don't know if she was specifically focused on him alone. I do know that she was coming kind of into the point where it would have been a crossfire situation with Officer Anderson and McNew.
What does that mean in terms of what direction she was moving?
That she was coming towards them. And then part of positional is the CSI report indicated where shots were fired and where evidence was located. And it doesn't necessarily, kind of like perspective photography, unless you have multiple points, you can't determine the exact point that somebody was standing. But it gives you kind of a general idea of where they might have been located at the time shots were fired.
And does, considering crossfire situation of where Officer Anderson was in relation to Officer McNew and where Officer McNew was in relation to Officer Anderson, is that a factor that they take into consideration in those moments of deciding to use force?
I mean, that's part of our training. We do talk about backdrop and crossfire situations. And officers are, the hope and the goal is that through training and through practice, that they start realizing that it's not just what you're shooting at, but what is behind that. And if you know where your partner is at the time, then you want to keep that in thought as well. For instance, we just had training related to traffic stops and positioning on that, where your partner would be and where you would have to, ensuring that you wouldn't have a crossfire situation if your partner's on the other side of the car, and how to prevent that. So it's something that's regularly taught in training, and you hope that it translates to the real world in those situations.
And do you know whether Officer McNew could see where Officer Anderson was at the time that he fired?
I don't know. I know that he indicated that he knew that where Officer Anderson was at one point in time, and knew that he was off to the left, but I don't know if he knew the exact position or the location. And in the perspective photography, it only shows his location as well as Ms. Lyles' location. It doesn't indicate where Officer Anderson was, which oftentimes if officers are not sure where the other officer is, they will not place a placard for that person.
Go back to the 8.200 using force policy, please, now. And it's sub number 3. Officers should assess and modulate the use of force as resistance changes. Can you please explain what that means to the jury?
Yeah, if I have a person that is fighting with me, physically fighting with me, and I am able to get them into custody and they stop fighting, I'm supposed to modulate my force. In other words, I'm supposed to stop my force. If I have a shooting incident where I have to engage somebody with lethal force, and that threat is no longer a threat. In other words, that person goes to the ground, drops the knife, drops a gun, whatever. At that point in time, I should stop my force, and I should take additional steps at that point in time, as in placing the person in handcuffs, things like that.
Did this policy apply to Officers Anderson and McNew in this case?
Yes, ma'am.
And did they comply with this provision in your opinion?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you explain that to the jury?
Yes, both officers fired, I believe one fired 3 rounds, one fired 4 rounds, and they indicated that once the Ms. Lyles went to the ground that they stopped firing.
And does that mean that there was no resistance changes in Ms. Lyles' behavior, in your opinion, to address some other use of force rather than firing their weapons?
I don't think I understand.
Does this policy also address situations where it says assess and modulate the use of force as resistance changes? So can you give an example of where resistance from a suspect might change and use of a firearm would not be necessary?
Sure. An incident, if somebody has a knife and has that knife and appears to be wanting to assault me, and I say, drop the knife, get back, and that person drops the knife and gets back, I would not have to use additional force at that point in time. I may be able to, the highest level of force at that point in time might be pointing a firearm at the person and then going and putting handcuffs on them. Where somebody who doesn't comply and comes forward with a knife, I might have to use deadly force. And then again, so the threat level changed there. So a compliant person versus non-compliant person.
Thank you. And obviously we know that Ms. Lyles died in this situation and this was a use of deadly force. Can you describe the policy that's listed as number 4 of when the use of deadly force is allowed?
Yes, so deadly force is authorized. Deadly force may only be used in circumstances where there's a threat or of death or serious physical injury to the officer or others is imminent. And the danger is imminent when objectively a reasonable officer would believe that a subject is acting or threatening to cause death or serious physical injury to the officers or others, and the subject has the means or instrumentalities to do so, and the subject has the opportunity and ability to use the means or instrumentalities to cause death or serious physical injury.
And is it your opinion that this policy applied in this situation?
Yes, ma'am.
And did the officers comply with it?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you please explain your reasoning for that?
So the subject had multiple knives and was attempted to stab Officer Anderson and then continued to come at Officers Anderson and McNew. She was armed with a weapon, which is considered the instrumentalities to inflict the serious bodily harm or death. And she had the ability to do so by, again, unrestricted, unabated access to the officers at the time.
And included in this policy is that it must be an imminent threat. Would you say that this was at this time?
Yes, ma'am. She was advancing on the officers at the time.
What type of, are there different types of force defined in the policy manual?
Yes, ma'am.
What are they?
There's de minimis force, which is non-reportable force. So that's just grabbing onto somebody and moving them, things like that. And there's type 1 force. We define it as type 1 force, which is transitory pain that doesn't cause injury, or pointing of a firearm. I mentioned that before. I believe in this policy as well. I think a hobble restraint is considered a type 1 use of force as well. That's where you might have to tie their legs. Type 2 force is more than transitory pain, but less than type 3 pain, which is that serious force. The type 2 pain causes injury, but it's minor injury. And then it also in our policy defines the type 2 injury is injuries caused or used by different less lethal devices. So OC spray, taser, baton, things like that would be considered type 2 depending on injury level. And then the last one, which is the one that FIT generally investigates, are the high level uses of force where you have serious injury, great bodily harm, serious or temporary disfigurements, loss of consciousness, officer involved shootings, several other things.
So this was a type 3 use of force, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm just pulling up the definition of type 3. There it is. Oh, oops, a little bit down. And if you could just read that out.
Can I just have clarification? What is a type 3? That it is a type 3.
This was, I thought he said this was a type 3 use of force. And I was just about to ask him to read the definition of type 3.
This being the guns or the knives?
The guns. Up on the screen and in front of you, if you have the definition of type 3 use of force.
Yes. Force that causes or is reasonably expected to cause great bodily harm, substantial bodily harm, loss of consciousness or death, and or the use of neck or carotid holes. Stop sticks for motorcycles, impact weapons to the head.
And so when an officer uses any type of force, it's given a designation of de minimis or type 1 through type 3. Is that right?
Correct.
And then are there protocols that need to be followed for each type of use of force?
Yes, 1 second. Yes, ma'am.
For a type 3 use of force, what is required?
Notification to a supervisor. The supervisor will respond at that point in time, and then they will call the force investigation team. They will also notify the dispatch and the chain of command. So the chiefs and assistant chiefs the chief and the assistant chiefs will be notified as well.
And is there a requirement that someone who uses following the use of force, that officer shall render or request medical aid?
Can you repeat that? I apologize.
Sorry, it's 8.200 sub 6. I'm going to ask about following a use of force, officer shall render or request medical aid if needed or if requested by anyone as soon as reasonably possible.
Yes, ma'am. That's part of policy.
Mr. Administrator, we appear to have lost Mr. Welcome. May I have him on with the laptop?
A very brief one.
This is not Mr. Buck's witness. It's okay. He's still listening to the last stream. So
Oh, he is? Okay, thank you. We'll try later.
All right, going back to 8.200 sub 6, which is now on the screen. Did this policy apply here in this situation?
Yes, ma'am.
And did the officers comply with it?
Yes, ma'am.
How did they do that?
So it says request or render aid. They did both. Initially, right after the officer involved shooting, they requested fire medics. They requested additional resources as well. And then once the scene was safe, in other words, once the apartment was clear and the children were removed from the apartment, they began rendering first aid on Ms. Lyles.
So I'm talking specifically about Officers Anderson and Officers McNew. So did both of them request aid over the radio or in some other way?
Officer Anderson did not. Officer McNew did. The policy, this came up before. It's for the officers on the scene. If somebody calls and requests aid, then the policy requirement has been met. If every single officer called for fire, we would jumble the air. We would make it so that other information doesn't get out. So if somebody on scene at that use of force requests aid, then that policy requirement has been met.
So what, after Officer McNew requested it on the radio, then Officer Anderson was not required to make that request?
That's correct.
And you said that you said officers rendered aid. Did you mean that Officers Anderson or Officer McNew rendered
I don't
aid?
recall that either one of them did. I know that Officer Schickler and the other officers that responded as backup, once they got the children out of the apartment, then they began rendering aid.
So by requesting aid, Officers Anderson and McNew complied with this policy according to SPD protocol?
Yes, at the time it didn't say and, it said or. So by doing one or the other, but officers did both in this instance. And again, it doesn't have to be the officers that use the force to render aid, just officers on the scene of that use of force have to try to render aid, which they did.
You said that at that time it said, it didn't say and. Does it now say and?
I just took this
Then
training.
let's go.
Sorry.
Stay.
And now, next looking at 8.300 policy number 4.
I'm sorry, which one? 8.30.
The title of this one is use of force firearm.
Okay.
And the text that we have that applies in this situation, or that I'm going to ask you about, is number 7. What does that indicate?
Officers shall issue a verbal warning to the subject and fellow officers prior to shooting a firearm.
And can you read the paragraph to the jury, please?
I'm sorry, what?
Read the paragraph there to the jury.
Yes. Officers shall issue a verbal warning to the subject, other officers, and other individuals present that a firearm will be shot and defer shooting the firearm a reasonable amount of time to allow the subject to comply with the warning.
And did Officer Anderson or McNew issue a verbal warning in this situation?
Both of them did, and there's also an exception to this rule on the next page.
I'm sorry, did you indicate that they both stated that a firearm would be shot?
No, they gave verbal warnings. They did not give the whether or not a firearm would be shot.
Okay, so number 7 requires that give a verbal warning, but you said there's an exception to that.
Correct.
Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, the exception is a verbal warning is not required if giving the warning would compromise the safety of the officers or others. In such circumstances, the deploying officer should document his or her reason for believing his or her safety would have been compromised in his or her use of force statement.
And so did Officer McNew and Anderson comply with this policy in your opinion?
Yes, both of the officers indicated that it was a very rapidly evolving situation and that they had already given verbal warnings and that she, Ms. Lyles, still was continuing to assault or coming at them.
So, but the verbal warning required by this policy was not given, but they complied with it because the exception applies.
That's correct.
I believe those are all the questions I have regarding policy at this time. I'm going to pass the microphone off. Good afternoon, sir. My name is Karen Kohler.
Good afternoon.
So where were the children in all of this? How did the policies apply to them?
Objection, babe.
Overruled.
Scope.
Overruled.
To my knowledge, they were in the living room area.
Well, let's go through it in a little bit more detail. You were present when Officer Anderson, I believe you said, and Officer McNew gave statements. Am I correct?
I was present for Officer Anderson's initial statement, and I believe I was there for potentially one, if not, I believe one of Officer McNew's or Officer McNew's follow-up.
In addition, you reviewed everything in great detail because of your role in the investigation. Am I correct?
That's correct.
So you were aware of how close the child, in particular, the small child whom Officer Anderson called the infant, was to his mother at the time this happened. Am I correct?
Specifically where they were at, I don't know. I do know that they were in the living room area.
Were you told that Ms. Lyles, after approaching Officer Anderson, who described the flash of the knife, was told to get back and she indeed walked back? You remember that whole sequence?
Yes, ma'am.
At that moment when she walked back, do you know how close the infant was to her?
I do not.
Do you remember Officer Anderson saying that the infant was by her feet?
I do not recall.
Do you remember Officer Anderson saying that it was either by her feet, within 1 foot, or 2 feet of Ms. Lyles?
Objection, babe. Also speculation.
If you know.
I don't recall.
Do you recall Officer Anderson testifying that when he finally did shoot Ms. Lyles, she was maybe 3 or 4 feet away from that infant?
I don't recall specific distances. I do know that they said that the child or the children were in the living room.
In deciding to exercise force, is it not a policy of the Seattle Police Department not to endanger innocent other individuals?
It's to protect officers and others.
Do officers get protection first above the public?
Nope.
In this case, where was the second child?
Objection, calls for speculation.
If he knows, he can answer.
From my records of what I recall is that both children were in the living room.
Well, the living room is on the other side of the kitchen counter, right?
Yes,
So one was the infant who was at his mother's feet, and the other was a disabled child who was where? Do you know?
in the living room.
Do you know how many additional feet away from Ms. Lyles and the infant?
No,
Do you know if Officer Anderson could see either child when he was shooting Ms. Lyles?
I don't know.
Do you know if Officer McNew could see either child when he was shooting Ms. Lyles?
I do not.
And you know that there was a third child in the apartment on the other side of the wall of the living room, am I correct?
The officers did not know about that person until after the shooting.
And therefore they were shooting Ms. Lyles without being able to see either one of her teeny children in the living room or the child on the other side of the wall. Am I correct?
Objection, argumentative.
Overruled.
When they were shooting Ms. Lyles, they could not see either child, either the infant or the disabled child in the living room, and they cannot see the other child on the other side of the wall of the living room. Am I correct?
Also calls for speculation.
Overruled. He can answer if he knows.
The information that I had was that the children were in the living room. She was not holding the children, but whether or not they could see the children, I don't know.
Well, my only question is whether they could see the children. Wasn't that important for you to know if they were shooting and could see the children or not?
If she was holding the children, then that would be important, but she wasn't holding the children at the time. And whether or not they could see the children at the feet or in the living room, I don't know.
So in investigating a shooting death inside someone's house with 3 children present, it's not important for Seattle Police Department to know if the officers were firing
Objection,
and
argumentative.
able to see the children or not?
Objection, argumentative.
Sustained. You can rephrase.
You mentioned that they were, well,
let's go another step farther. Not only could they not see the children, they could not see each other. Isn't that true?
To my understanding, they knew kind of the general location where they were at, but did not necessarily see exactly where they were.
Okay, let me ask that question again. My understanding is that neither Officer Anderson or Officer McNew could see each other at the time that they were shooting Charleena Lyles. Is that correct?
That's an answer.
No, overruled.
Can you repeat that, please?
At the time that Officer McNew and Officer Anderson were shooting Ms. Lyles, they could not see each other.
I don't recall exactly what they said in their statements. I do know that they knew the general location, but I don't know if they specifically said that they saw each other.
Well, let's assume that they testified multiple times that neither one could see each other, just to make that assumption. Okay. And I think that you said to us today that they, oh my gosh, I don't know the technical term, for when you're shooting, one person's shooting one direction, the other one is shooting the other direction, crossfire. How do you determine a crossfire when you can't see each other or the other people in the unit, other than the target?
Knowing general locations of where people are.
So if you don't know the general locations, then that would have been a violation of policy, am I correct?
No.
Testimony.
Is that correct?
Overruled.
No,
So let me get
it's
this.
one of, sorry,
No,
You wanna go ahead?
No, I want you to finish.
it's one of the considerations of whether or not they know their backdrop. And knowing generally where your officer or your partner is a consideration. For example, if I do a traffic stop and I know that my partner's on the side of the car that I'm not on, and I'm contacting the driver, I may not be able to see directly where that officer is. They might be in my peripheral, they might not be in my vision at all, but I know that my passenger, my backup officer's on the other side of the car. So if I have to engage in a shooting at that point in time, I would be cognizant not to be firing towards that officer if at all possible.
Did you, in your role, and everyone else that's SVD, who's reviewing this matter, did you determine whether or not these officers could see any of the other 4 bodies other than themselves, 2 children in the living room, one on the other side of the wall, and the other officer? So could they see any of those other 4 people as they were shooting Ms. Lyles?
Objection, repetitive. Also an answer. Also scope. This goes to SPD's review. It's outside the scope.
Overruled.
They could not see the child that was in the bedroom, because that person did not appear until after the shooting. Officer Anderson, I don't know if they saw each other or just knew their general location. I don't recall, as I mentioned before, I don't recall where the children were. I do know that they were in the living room. I don't know how close they were. And I don't know if the officer saw them. Whether or not that is contained in their statements, I would defer to those.
Well, that's a whole lot of do not knows when you're asked to sit here in front of a jury and tell them that
Objection, argumentative.
this was a shooting that was
Sustained.
according to policy.
Objection.
Sustained.
They did not tell Ms. Lyles to drop her knife. Neither one of them did, am I correct?
You can't tell from the audio. The only thing that you can hear is get back, get back.
Let me repeat. They did not tell Ms. Lyles to drop the knife. Am I correct?
Objection, ask an answer.
Overruled.
I cannot say for certain. If you listen to the audio, you can also hear that the audio drops several times, so you can make out certain things. So I don't know if that was ever mentioned. I don't know. I do know that they said get back several times.
Okay. You participated in their interviews, and they said that they didn't say those words. You never even asked if they said those words. Am I correct?
Oh,
You never told Ms. Lyles, or they never told Ms. Lyles, we are going to shoot if you don't drop that weapon. Did
I
they
don't.
ever say that?
I don't believe so, no.
When you heard Officer McNew discuss being in the kitchen, being wholly distracted by the meatloaf on the counter,
or I guess on the stove, you knew at that time that that was against policy. Am I correct as a cover officer?
Objection, misstates facts.
Overruled.
No, part of your cover officer's duties is to know your surroundings as well, whether or not there's weapons on the counter, whether or not there are people hiding in rooms. The cover or the contact person is covering the person that they're talking to, and then the cover officer is responsible for the rest of the surroundings.
So are you saying that by not noticing that there were, I don't know, 7 knives or so on the counters, that there was a child in the room that they didn't even know about, that Officer McNew failed in his role as a cover officer before this shooting ever began?
Absolutely.
Objection, argumentative, misstates facts.
Overruled.
Absolutely no.
You also said that they had I always forget the word of it, a fast plan? A serious, what is a quick and dirty plan? What is the word for that?
Hasty?
Hasty plan. They have a hasty plan, which is, let me write it down, I wrote it down. The hasty plan was to not let her get between them or behind them. Is that your understanding?
No,
Or is it?
not to let her get behind them.
You know who, well, I won't make you. Can I ask a question, Your Honor, my understanding was that, I don't want to, well, I was, and I want to make sure that, you know, maybe something changed, like this was going to be Ms. witness until this morning. So I just want to make sure that I understand. I thought that, I'm sorry, hold on just a moment. I thought that this witness was instead of coroner, and that we could use coroner's deposition. Is that true?
Objection, we'd object to that, Your Honor.
That's how it's listed in the exhibits. It's exhibit number 94.
Can use coroner's statement.
I'm sorry.
His statement, or I'm sorry, her statement.
But only consistent with motions, correct?
Yes.
I couldn't hear that.
Yes.
My understanding is that if you look at exhibit number 94, it's listed as Davison Cordner. And my understanding was that because Cordner wasn't produced, we could use the deposition of Cordner to impeach the witness.
So we take our afternoon recess.
Thank you.
Recording stopped.